So welcome back to the EAC 2020 Elections Disability Forum. We're going to start panel 3 now. This panel is vote by mail and electronic ballot delivery systems. So I'll just have a few opening comments, and then I'm going to get to my panelists who will each make a short statement, maybe 5 minutes, and then we'll have some questions. I'll have some questions, and we'll get questions from you. So while in-person voting remains the most frequently used method of casting a ballot in the United States, vote by mail has become an increasingly important election tool for millions of voters, especially those who have transportation barriers to precincts. Oregon and Washington were early adopters of vote by mail, but it is spreading eastward from the west. And according to the EAC's most recent election administration and voting survey, by mail voting was used by a quarter of the electorate in 2018. As states expand vote by mail options, we anticipate this figure to grow in 2020 presidential election and beyond. While vote by mail may be a matter of convenience for many voters and perhaps save money for election jurisdictions, it can be indispensable for voters with disabilities. But it is vitally important that people with disabilities have access to vote by mail. However, barriers do exist with these types of voting methods. While many voters with disabilities, including individuals who are blind, visually impaired, or have mobility challenges, while they find vote by mail a cumbersome and entirely inaccessible process, it is an option for them. And vote by mail or making paper ballot, marking a paper ballot for those who need assistance may impinge on a voter's privacy and independence. Today, we'd like to discuss potential vote by mail options for people with disabilities. Methods currently being utilized include electronic ballot delivery systems, where a voter electronically receives the ballot, marks it at a home computer, and returns the ballot through the U.S. mail, the traditional absentee paper ballot process, and pilot systems that offer a form of remote voting. So I look forward to our conversation about accessible vote by mail ballots and electronic ballot delivery systems, given the current environment of the heightened election security concerns. So please allow me to introduce our panelists. On my right, far right, Amelia Powers Gardner, who's the Clerk and Auditor for Utah County, Utah. Welcome, Amelia. And then next to her is Maurice Turner, Deputy Director of the Internet Architecture Project from the Center for Democracy and Technology. Then I have right next to me, Clark Rachfal. Is that how we say it? Rachfal. Director of Advocacy and Governmental Affairs, American Council for the Blind. And at the end, Caleb Thornton, Legal Policy and Rulemaking Manager for the Colorado Secretary of State's Office. So welcome to my panelists. Why don't we start with you? Caleb on the end.
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks so much, and thanks to you all for having us out here today. I'll be just briefly kind of talking about what we do in Colorado and the some of the changes that we've rolled out over the last year. Colorado likes to come to these things and brag about ourselves, so I'm not going to be any different. I won't buck that trend. Sorry. So in Colorado, we send a mail ballot to all voters who are eligible to vote. Who are registered to vote. And we send those ballots out through 8 days before an election. After that point, you can go to a voter service and polling center to vote in person. We also have same-day voter registration, so you can always go to a VSPC to register yourself to vote and to cast a ballot at the same time. Along with that, so we send a mail ballot out to everybody who is registered to vote, obviously, and that, as we've kind of discussed, brings some benefits and certainly some challenges, particularly for persons with disabilities. Those challenges, I think, were recognized by the legislature over the last year. So the big change that they made during the 2019 legislative session is they allowed for the electronic delivery of a ballot to a voter with a disability. Essentially what we do is we use the same electronic delivery system that we've been using for our military and overseas voters for some time. Colorado law has allowed for military and overseas voters to request an electronic ballot be delivered to them for years now, and we've had systems in place to do that. What this legislation allowed us to do is provide that same type of service, but provide it for a voter who has a disability. So basically what the system does right now is if a voter with a disability wants to vote on their home computer or somewhere, not at a VSPC, and they don't want to vote their mail ballot, they essentially go to our website that we provide to overseas and military voters as well. They go there, they go through the process of requesting a ballot, which is all on screen. They vote the ballot on screen, and at the end, they print that ballot. They sign it, and then they return it either through the mail or by dropping it off to their county clerk and recorder. So that's the big change that we made over the last year. I want to give a big shout out, particularly to our vendor who we've been using to help us roll out that process, Democracy Live. So they've really assisted us in getting that up and running. I think the big challenge that we saw with this rollout, so we've used it in the 2019 coordinated election. We are using it currently in the Super Tuesday primary, which is now open for voting. The big challenge we've had, frankly, is just getting the word out that this system exists for voters with disability. I think people are so used to, in Colorado, having that ballot mailed to them and just voting it at home and returning it, that we didn't see the volume that we would have liked in the last November election. Obviously, it was also new, so we expect that usage to go up over time. But that's, the big challenge that we saw was just, frankly, low usage of the system. So, so that's generally how we do elections in Colorado. I'd be interesting to hear some of the questions that come up later. There's been a lot of discussion already today about paper ballots, how accessible they are, how secure they are. Obviously, in Colorado, we like to talk a lot about our risk limiting audits and the security that brings, understanding that no system is perfect. Obviously, that also requires paper ballots, so to do a risk limiting audit. So I'd be interested in hearing some of the questions that come up as we go through this panel.
Hey, thanks, Caleb. Next, we'll go to Clark. Clark, do you want me to help you with your system? There we go. You're on. All right.
There
Thank
we
you.
go. All right, and thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, everyone, for letting me speak on this panel today. So the American Council of the Blind is a nationwide consumer membership organization. We have over 70 state and special interest affiliates who are their own 501c3s that then associate with the national umbrella organization of ACB. Our members have been working, as long as the ADA has been around and even longer, trying to ensure access and being able to independently and privately cast their ballots. This challenge has, for a long time, been at the polling place itself. And a lot of progress has been made in that regard over the 30 years of the ADA. And many folks, because they fought so hard for that right, they will always go to the polling place to cast their ballot along with other citizens. However, there are a lot of people with disabilities and other conditions that make it very difficult to arrange transportation or independently travel to the polling location. And in those instances, people with disabilities would like to participate and have the right to participate in absentee voting, just like all other citizens. Last year, ACB, the National Council of Independent Living, along with legal representation, the Washington Lawyers Committee, and Shepard Mullen, began conversations with the Secretary of State's office for West Virginia. Because in West Virginia, the only option for absentee voting was vote by mail with a paper ballot. And just a quick recap, to do that, somebody would have to print out the paper ballot, be able to read it, be able to mark it, sign it, and mail the corresponding envelope back to the Elections Committee. Each of those steps could pose a barrier for somebody who is blind and visually impaired or has mobility, dexterity related disabilities. So West Virginia was running a pilot program, an ongoing pilot program for their uniform and overseas citizens, their U of Cava voters, and that was using the Votes smartphone application. And through work with the Secretaries of State office, there was a bill, SB 94, that was introduced and passed both the House and Senate and was signed into law by the governor of West Virginia, that is not specific to votes, but is a bill that allows voters with disabilities to use electronic ballot marking and casting devices to be able to vote absentee. The American Council of the Blind, as an organization, we are technology agnostic. We don't care what specific solution is in place, but we want to ensure that voters with disabilities have the same rights and access as all other voters in a state. So we're excited that West Virginia has passed this law and will have a system in place by their May primary.
Thanks so much, Clerk. Appreciate it. Let's go to Maurice Turner now.
Good afternoon. I want to say first, this is an exciting time in election technology. There is a lot of attention from some folks who have been around this field for a while, but also some new attention from new entrants. And so for me, that means that it's a time for innovation and investment and development so that we can help get to a place where it's just easier for everyone to be able to vote. And by everyone, I mean everyone, literally everyone. So I am encouraged by the kind of attention that elections are now getting. I'm somewhat discouraged by some of the conflicts that are now brewing within the election community when it comes to issues related to accessibility and security. I think that they are definitely challenges that need to be addressed, but recognizing that because it is everyone's right to vote privately, independently, and security, that everyone should be working toward that same goal. So I believe that if there is a way to encourage further investment, development, and innovation in the field, that we would all be better for it. I wanted to call out some specific examples of what I mean by having some new entrants come in who do have some consideration for both the accessibility and security aspects of elections. Voting Works is a relative newcomer. We've seen a couple of pilots in Mississippi, and then recently this week also in Wisconsin, where you have equipment and software that's designed to be open source and commercial off the shelf in a way that really provides researchers and advocates a way to examine sort of the behind the scenes and under the covers aspects of the systems so that there are as few surprises as possible. And I think that's really a key to all of this as we're going through developing election technologies. You know, what does it look like to actually be able to have a clear understanding of how the technology works so that all sides of it can be considered and that there are few surprises. We really don't want to be in a place where we are now in some precincts where you have some of the ballot marking devices off to the side and not oft used, or solutions are being developed and pushed out onto a community of users without full thoughtfulness of how it's going to be used. Really struck by Diane's comments earlier relating to, you know, a paper ballot is inaccessible. You know, that's a very powerful statement to me and something that I'll hold on to. And I think it's worth remembering that just taking something out of a context doesn't automatically make it more accessible or truly meet the needs of the users that they're designed to meet. And so I look forward to the rest of our conversations today to learn how, when we're thinking about ideas of getting ballots into the hands of individuals with accessibility needs, you know, what does it actually mean to make that a more full and equal experience?
Thanks, Maurice. Amelia?
Thank you. As was said, my name is Amelia Gardner, and I'm the Utah County Clerk Auditor. It's a dual position. I'm both the clerk and the auditor for the county. I'm really quite new to government, and I'm very new to elections. I was elected in in November of 2018. So I've only been in office, took office January 2019 for about 14 months. And I've got a lot of naivety in this space, and that has become an advantage, I'm finding. I was new to elections administration, and as I came into elections administration, the concept of the accessibility, I immediately saw the need for that. I am the youngest of 5 to a single disabled mother, and I spent most of my life advocating with my mom. She's really, really smart, very, very capable, and very hardworking, but she spent a lot of my life in a wheelchair, and she was born legally blind. So immediately when the access to voting was brought up during my election, I recognized that the group of citizens like my mom, I was going to be a fierce advocate for, regardless of any blowback I received. So that naivety has helped me. When I first came into office, we needed a better solution for our overseas citizens. And my county went with the mobile voting votes option. After a successful pilot in August of 2019, it was pointed out to me that we could utilize, under state law, we could utilize this same solution for people with disabilities. And without hesitation, I said, absolutely, let's do it. And I received a lot of pause. People said, are you sure? I was like, yeah, of course. Why would we not offer something to people with disabilities that can have it? And the naivety helped in the aspect that I didn't realize that I was going to be the first jurisdiction in the country to offer this to disabled people. It didn't even occur to me. After I had approved it, then people came back and said, are you sure you want to be the first? And my problem was the fact that, why was I the first? Right? This was a no-brainer to me. I said, absolutely. And I have thus been fried on Twitter for it. And I don't really care. Because the people frying me on Twitter are not my mother. They're not the 106-year-old lady down the street that we literally brought the ballot to. And they're not the people in my community that elected me to ensure their right to vote was preserved. It's a bunch of random people on Twitter that I've never met. So, like I said, being new to government has actually been fantastic for my ability to be an advocate, because I don't realize the blowback till after it happens. But really, I was elected to represent all the citizens in my county. Mine is a partisan race, but that doesn't mean that I only represent the party that I am a member of. I represent all citizens, regardless of their political affiliation, their identity, the color of their skin, or their ability to mark a paper ballot. I represent all of them. And it's my job to ensure that every one of them has a right to vote. With that said, one of the most eye-opening things to me, and I know this should be a no-brainer, but it's not. Not all disabilities are the same, and therefore not all solutions should be the same. When I landed here yesterday, I got in an Uber to go to the hotel, and the Uber driver was making conversation, and I mentioned to him that I was going to be speaking on a panel for accessibility with people with disabilities. And his reply to me was, well, what disability? So my reply was, all disabilities? Not all disabilities are alike. Therefore, not all solutions are alike. So in my county, we try to do everything to ensure all citizens' right to vote independently and privately. We are a vote-by-mail county. We have roughly 300,000 registered active voters, and we mail a ballot to all 300,000. On top of that, we have polling locations that every one of them has an express vote. I've heard that mentioned several times, that that's a solution that a lot of people use. We use the ES&S express vote. On top of that, we have curbside voting available, and we also utilize the Votes app for mobile voting. One thing that I wanted to mention before I finish up is, as I go through this process, I am so new that I see a lot of things for the first time, and it's very eye-opening for me. We had a wonderful lady vote in our last election. Her name is Maxine Grimmett, and Maxine is Utah's oldest active voter. She is 106 years old. She will be 107 next time we bring her a ballot. And Maxine was born before women had the right to vote. And Maxine is voting in every election. Now, about a year ago, at 105 years old, Maxine fell and broke her ankle. And when you're 105 years old, your ankle doesn't heal in 6 weeks with a cast. So Maxine is now home-ridden. Her caretaker is her daughter, who happens to be 85 years old. So her daughter isn't really picking her up and putting her in the car to bring her to a polling location to vote. So we wanted to bring the ballot to her. Now, I've had people say to me, well, you mailed Maxine a ballot. Why doesn't she just mark the ballot you mailed her? During our pilot, I wanted to see this firsthand. So we drove to her house. Well, first we asked, does she have a smartphone? It's like, no, she's 106 years old. She does not have a smartphone. Well, does her daughter have a smartphone? Her daughter is 85 years old. She does not have a smartphone. So the Votes app was able to go on an iPad. And so we have iPads that we use as poll pads at our locations. We took one of the iPads, we put the Votes app on the iPad, and we brought that iPad to Maxine. In order to allow Maxine to vote, she had to fill out a piece of paper and sign it saying, yes, I'm disabled and I want to utilize this system. And as we had her filling out that paper, this light came on above my head. Maxine is having a hard time holding a pen. A paper ballot would not work for Maxine. She cannot mark a ballot. She has a hard time holding a pen. In fact, the only reason we were able to verify her signature on that paper to say that she really did want to use the mobile voting app was because I watched her sign that paper. When she registered to vote in 1930, her signature looked a little different. So we always can improve. We can always get better. I've heard great things now. Just so you know, after that, in this election, we now have an electronic way for people with disabilities to register to use the mobile app. I don't know why it didn't occur to me before that having them sign a piece of paper was probably not the best option. But we have rectified that. But I'm excited to be here because I'm always looking for better ways. And I want to offer every solution that I can to my citizens.
Thanks, Amelia. So a number of these voting methods that you've mentioned all across the board are controversial in some way or another because of the election security issues. How do we balance, and I'll hear from any one of you who want to, how do we balance that concern about the security with the accessibility on some of these methods? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can start with that. The way that I balance these is, number one, I want to look for the most secure method that I can. For my overseas voters and for my voters with disabilities, state law requires me to offer them an electronic solution, which oftentimes equals email. So if I can find a solution that is more secure than email, I don't let perfect be the enemy of good. If my solution is not perfect, if it's better than what I currently have, I don't let the noise on the fringes prevent me from providing a solution to a voter.
Maurice is going to go.
So putting on my IT hat, I'm hearing all these ways that you're letting people vote, and it scares me because all of those ways of voting are also ways that the system can be attacked. But I understand why. So there's a good reason why you want to accept that level of risk. So for me, it comes down to, do you have the infrastructure in place to be able to protect the voters, given all these methods? Do you have the staff in place to be able to monitor all these different ways of voting to make sure that there's no malicious interference? Do you have the money in place to be able to support all of these different methods? And so I think that for a county or any other jurisdiction to be able to consider different ways of voting, that those are the conversations that need to happen. And then above all of it, are the policies and laws that you have in place, are they supportive of what you want to do? And what needs to change in order to make sure that you're not running afoul of those laws, but you're making sure that you are actually meeting the needs of all of your voters, regardless of the method?
All right. Thanks, Maurice.
I think it's important to realize that our current voting system is not 100% secure as well. So if I use a ballot marking device at a polling location and it prints out a paper ballot, how do I, as someone who is blind, verify what has actually been marked on that ballot? And once that ballot's cast, how do I know that somebody else hasn't gone and voted down ballot for races that have not been filled out. With some of these electronic options, a version of the ballot can be saved and can be referenced by the voter. And as someone who is using the system, that gives me more peace of mind. I think as we talk about security, we also need to remember that if we're going to be concerned about potentially votes being manipulated, we need to make sure that first, people have access to vote, and then second, that their votes can be cast and verified as part of that conversation as well.
I just wanted to add one more thing, and that's that an election can be swayed just as easily by preventing people from voting as it can by changing someone's vote. And any time that we prevent a disabled person from voting because we didn't make it accessible, we've changed an election.
Do you have anything, Caleb? Okay. The methods that we're talking about now, I think, are picking up in popularity. We're seeing more popularity with vote by mail. We're seeing more absentee voting. We're seeing more vote by mail. It's starting slowly. Are we going to reach a tipping point where people expect that this is the way they're going to be able to vote in the future? And is that going to come sooner or later? And are the security concerns going to stop us from hitting that tipping point where people expect this to happen?
I do think that, I think we're seeing it already. The popularity of vote by mail is spreading east, as you mentioned. I know Utah now, I believe, is 100% vote by mail. So we've got a whole bunch of Western states that are either there already or are getting there. And I think that just, for example, in Colorado, we do have ballot questions, and they are long. And we have some counties where, you may have a 3, even 4-card ballot in November. The ability to have that ballot at home and to take some time to research those ballot questions is frankly invaluable to our voters. I don't think that they would ever go back from voting by mail because they have that ability to put the ballot on their kitchen table and to Google, what do I want to do on ballot question 6A, which is 2 paragraphs long and is basically unreadable. So I do think that popularity is going to spread. Obviously, there are security concerns that come with any, method of voting, right? I like to tout the stuff that we do for security in Colorado. I mean, we were called the safest state to cast a vote for a reason. It's because we have paper ballots. It's because we do risk limiting audits. It's because, our voting equipment is air gapped. We have controls in place. We have, bipartisan election teams that do everything on the tabulation side. But I recognize, no system is perfect. Absolutely. As we've talked about in this room, the ability to verify, for a voter to verify what's on that piece of paper, it can be a challenge, obviously, for a voter with a disability. So, I think those security concerns will always be there. I think I like the idea of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Colorado is always either at the top or near the top for voter participation. And I frankly, believe that that's because voters get that ballot in the mail 3 weeks before Election Day because they can vote, and register up to and on Election Day because we make it easy and accessible for the general population. And I think, this expansion into, providing an electronic ballot to voters with disabilities is just another aspect of recognizing that this system, while is really good, is not perfect, and we'll continue to try to improve on that. On that note, I forget to give a shout out to the National Federation of the Blind, who has worked with us a lot on the development of this system. We have some really good folks in Colorado that we've been able to work with. I'm an attorney by trade, so I don't know the technology side of things. I really don't. That's not my expertise. Being able to work with people who use the system at their home, on their home computer, who can give me real-time feedback about, hey, X isn't working, Y isn't working, and being able to take that feedback back to our vendor has been invaluable. So I just wanted to give a shout out to those folks because they've really helped us in all those respects.
Clark, do you have anything to add?
Sure. just want to echo a lot of Caleb's points there. Golly, I hope we're reaching a tipping point, selfishly. But for folks that do have security concerns, or if there are security flaws that are identified, throwing the baby out with the bathwater is the wrong approach. If this mousetrap doesn't work, build a better mousetrap. But not allowing folks with disabilities to have access and equal access to absentee voting, that's not a credible solution.
Do either of you have anything to add? So at our election summit a couple months ago, Michelle Bishop, who's here, mentioned on one of the panels she was on that polling places will never close because those people with disabilities are going to expect to vote in polling places. With these kinds of systems, with vote by mail, with electronic ballot delivery systems, with the Votes app or online voting systems, will we see the end of the polling place at some point? Will the next generation expect to be able to vote on their phones?
I don't foresee a complete end of the polling location, but what I see is that we can scale them back significantly. 5 years ago, we had 120 polling locations in my county. Now we have 20. So we can scale it back significantly because of these other options like vote by mail and some of these things. But Utah, like Colorado, is a same-day voter registration state. So we need to have a way for people to come register to vote and cast a provisional ballot. And I also think it's an accessibility issue. Some people, they need to show up to the polls on election day. But what we do have the ability to do is scale that back and scale the cost of that back significantly while still allowing access to more people.
I agree that it seems like the idea of a polling place isn't going to go away, but I think the way that we conceptualize them is going to change. I definitely see that there's room for growth in terms of the way that we use vote centers, where there's going to be larger centers, people from multiple precincts can come in. Maybe there's some specialized volunteers that would be able to provide assistance to those that need it. And then thinking a little bit further forward, maybe one of the ways that we can mitigate some of that risk of mobile device voting is to say, well, you need to be physically in a vote center in order to use your own mobile device to come vote. So I think there are still some ways that we can utilize that physical location to bring people together and vote. But I don't think that we're going to keep this model of having small precinct-based polling places.
I think that the accessible absentee voting, that's just one tool in the toolbox that will not meet the needs of all voters. For example, if folks are either technology, if they struggle with technology like I do at times, or if they cannot afford a device, due to being low income, I think we will still need polling locations as another option, another available means of voting to try to ensure that everyone has access and has access in a way that meets their needs.
I just think everybody's going to want their I voted sticker too much, so we're never going to get away from it. It's hard to do that in vote by mail. Now, some counties do it.
I do it.
Okay, cool. My county did that at home too. But
Great. Doug, do you want to get some questions from the audience?
I do. And as I do, one thing I just want to note, again, you can note, react, or ignore, as I do think that one of the things that's worth noting is that as we reduce the number of in-person locations, you reduce the number of poll workers you need, which then enables you to focus more training on those folks and make them more capable. Any of those of you who have been parents, I call it the middle school PTA phenomenon, right? When you're in elementary school, there are lots of elementary schools and there are lots of people in the PTA. Then you go to middle school and there are fewer middle schools, and really only the real doobies end up being the ones who work on middle school PTAs, and so they tend to be really capable groups. By the time you get to high school, the kids are all on their own and the high schools don't need you as much. But to the extent that we can make those polling places like middle school PTAs with really well-trained, savvy poll workers and the like, I think that goes a long way towards addressing some of the issues that we see. And with that, I'm going to start right here.
I was going to follow up on that. That it's not just true for poll workers, but throughout the process. We have less resources in polling locations, which means we can focus more resources on securing all of the other areas of our election.
Thank you. Mark Guthrie. Amelia, this really for you, because it sounds like you've been real innovative there in your county. There are communities around this country that don't have adequate public transportation, lots of them. And I know in my county we face those challenges. And the significant reduction in polling places has had an impact on a lot of folks that don't have access to transportation. Do you have any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so our 20 polling locations that we have throughout the county, we spread them out as best we can, and we try to cover the rural areas of our county. Mine is the second largest county in the state of Utah, but it also has significantly rural areas. We have a very large geographic footprint, and we have just as many farming communities as we have city communities. We're actually the largest agricultural exporter in the state of Utah, so we have a lot of rural communities. And the first thing we try to do is make sure that we've spread these polling locations out and put them in rural communities just as much as the urban communities. But beyond that, that's why we want more accessible means like vote by mail, like mobile voting. Those are ways that we're hoping to help compensate for that beyond putting polling locations in the rural areas.
Here, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Juliana Guarenia, and I'm from Self Advocates Becoming Empowered. Our question is keeping in mind that people with disabilities and everybody else has the option to vote the way they want to vote, and again, depending on the state, what are the options? But how can we make sure that people with disabilities know about the various types of ballots that are available to use in their state? And then how many states have apps?
So this is Clark. I'll take a stab at that. At the American Council of the Blind, we try to educate our members and our affiliates as much as possible, and we feel like that's the best means for us to educate folks with disabilities in the states, as well as their local chapters of the affiliates as well. And the most common tip that we're able to provide for folks is to get in contact with the Secretary of State's office. Most of the states that I've personally investigated have always done a great job of displaying the available voting options in their states, and many of them are available either by email or by phone call. So, for example, when we first began looking into this issue, we reached out to Oregon, and we're discussing their vote-by-mail system as well as the accessibility solution that they have in place, which is to bring an accessible tablet to the voter's door for them to be able to cast a ballot. So it does take a little bit of legwork, but in most circumstances, we found the information is readily available.
If nobody else will, I can address that a little bit. First, I think there are 4 states that have the app available. I can think off the top of my head there were 5, but I think it's 4. So not a lot. And the second part, how do we get this out to the community? That's my biggest challenge. I mean, I'm new to this game, so any of you that have ideas, please come up to me afterwards. We are working with the Disability Law Center in our state. We are trying to work with as many advocacy groups as we can, trying to put it through social media. Literally in our last election, and we have a whole campaign this election, on social media, telling people, not saying, do you know somebody who could benefit from this? Do you know somebody with a disability? Please send them to this link. But that's my biggest challenge, is how do I let people know this is available to them?
I would mirror that as well. I mean, we rolled this out, I think I discussed it earlier, but we rolled this out in November. and the usage was very low statewide. And again, it was a new thing, so I get it. You know, you don't expect that you're going to have a huge turnout, but that is something we struggle with as well. We also been working with like Disability Law Colorado, National Federation of the Blind Colorado, other advocacy groups to try to get the word out about it. But I would love to hear, would love to hear your input as to how you think we can, get that word out there so that people will use the system. Because I think it is a great benefit to these voters, and I would love to see it be used so that we can go back to the legislature and show them, hey, you passed this, you let us do this. Now let me show you how much use it's actually getting. So.
Yeah, part of the challenge of that community outreach is the potential for abuse. Through misinformation. And so we saw that in 2016 where there were messages being amplified about, hey, just text your vote to this number and it'll count the same. Well, that can be a little difficult for someone who is a new voter or someone who's a disengaged voter. They might hear, oh, you can just download this app, but then they also saw the tweet that said you can text, and they're also hearing from other advocacy groups saying, like, don't believe those, you really do have to show up. So I think that's part of the challenge, especially for the election officials, is how do you get the message out in a way that's truthful and believable. And part of that is reinforcing the idea that the election officials are the trusted source of information, and that's who you should believe. And so bringing on community partners and going through the official is one way to help validate that message.
And then I'll just follow up. And anytime a jurisdiction is communicating to the public about voting, I think it would be very helpful to include information about accessible options or options for disabled voters as well. So it's not necessarily up for the individual to go hunting and search for it, but that it is readily available.
Lou Ann Blake. I have been using an electronic ballot delivery system in Maryland since it was first made available in 2016. It's a fantastic tool. I can use my own computer with my own access technology. I can vote when it's convenient for me, and I will probably never return to the polling place. So where it would be a good likelihood that I would have to deal with a poll worker who didn't know how to set up or operate the accessible ballot marking device. I think it also bears repeating what Diane Golden said earlier, that electronic ballot delivery is really the only accessible way that a deaf-blind voter can vote privately and independently. Caleb, I was going to ask you what organizations of disability-related organizations you were working with. I would suggest that you, if you're not already doing that, have election officials go out to meetings of these organizations, the NFB of Colorado. I don't know if the ACB has an affiliate in Colorado, but go to their meetings, talk to the members about the system. Go to the NFB of Colorado convention, annual convention. That's a great way to promote the system and let people know that it's available. And certainly once more and more people are using it, word of mouth is going to be a great way to get the word out too. The use of the system in Maryland has really increased over the years. I was also going to ask you, Caleb, are there any plans to expand the use of the system to make it available to all registered voters? And if not, why not? Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I know Maryland, I believe, may be the only state that allows all voters to receive their ballots electronically, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Okay. So all absentee voters. I think that's a great question. The issue we run into in Colorado is those paper ballots have become pretty important with risk limiting audits. Now, admittedly, you can have them still print and then return their ballot. I think a lot of voters have gotten used to the ballot in the mail. But in principle, I don't see an issue with going there. I think that you will get pushback, though, from people who have those security concerns, who see a mail ballot as a little bit more secure than the electronic delivery of a paper ballot. Essentially. So that's a good question. That's a good question for policymakers and not for the kind of people like me who just implement what they tell me to do.
I've got a question back here in the back. I do want to point out, I want to echo something that Lou Ann said. It sounds easy, but worth keeping in mind that a really valuable skill in anyone's pocket, but especially an election official, is talking to people and listening to what they say.
Hi, Whitney Quisenberry from the Center for Civic Design. I just wanted to weigh in with a little bit from California since they're all busy running an election today, this week. One of the things that California did when they passed the Voters' Choice Act was require that which enables county by county, the counties to adopt all vote by mail, plus vote centers. But one of the things that they did was required in the law that they not only do basic vote by mail, but that they have a remote accessible ballot marking option. Oregon actually has one as well. And we ran a workshop for NIST a few years ago, and every time we would get going on an idea, and someone would say, "Oh, it just sounds so great, but we won't be able to do it." The person in charge of that system in Colorado would raise his hands and say, "We've been doing that for in Oregon, would raise his hand and say, "We've been doing that for 7 years." So I think part of what we're seeing is an evolution here, and the only other thing I want to point out is that one of the advantages of being an all vote by mail state with remote ballot marking is that you've already mailed an envelope package to that voter. So they've already got the pre-labeled envelope, and if they print a ballot, they can put that right into that envelope, and they're not having to play origami to make one.
Other questions? Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Shay Anderson. I'm coming to you with a two-pronged approach. I'm Arkansas Statewide Independent Living Council Director, and I'm a Civic Engagement and Voting Rights Co-Chair with the Honorable Jim Dixon. This is a two-pronged statement. Doug, you mentioned PTAs. Well, I have to tell you, I'm on the National PTA Board, and that can be a platform when we reach out or when we evolve and we're thinking about the low-income families, the gentleman that mentioned low income. PTA is a grassroots and always on the ground getting things done when it comes to parental involvement in families. So that could be a platform for us when we evolve. You can use the parent centers in your schools. Usually each school or school districts have a parent center where parents can go and they can actually participate in a survey. We're doing the census in our schools in Little Rock School District. So I wanted to just put that out there, and that would be an opportunity for a conversation when we evolve there. Thank you.
Other questions? One in the back here.
Hi, my name is Ihab Sayed. I work for the ACLU, and we've talked a little bit throughout today about the votes technology specifically, and about West Virginia's SB 94. I just want to hear from y'all about whether the Votes app strikes the right balance between security and accessibility, and whether that's the direction that we should be moving in more very specifically, or if there is a better intervention.
I'll take this one. I think it gets closer. I think that we are looking at a situation, we'll just take West Virginia, for example, where the start was with the UOCAVA voters, traditionally much lower turnout, also traditionally having relatively insecure methods of returning ballots, whether it be by fax or email. And so I think, getting something that's better than fax or email is what we want to do. We want to continue to push, what does better mean? And how do we get to a sort of an equivalent domestic voting experience? We're not there yet. We still need more development. We need more pilot programs. I think an important part of that includes third-party security audits to make sure that not only the voters know how their ballot is being transmitted, but the election officials have an understanding during the procurement process of what does it actually mean to commit to a particular vendor's platform before it's too late. And by too late, I mean once they've already signed the contract, the deal's in place, the rollouts happen, and then new discoveries are made. And so I think that if we can get those security audits done, have that be part of the procurement process, it helps empower election officials to make a better buying decision, and then it also allows voters to feel a higher level of confidence that their ballot is actually going to be delivered and that there will be no changes.
Yeah, as the person on the panel who actually is a client of the Votes app, for me, absolutely it did. And I want to echo what he said, in that I started with pilot programs, and I'm still in the pilot phase, and we started with demographics that have a significantly less secure way. Ironically, on the flight here, I sat next to a lady who works for the State Department who told me the last time she voted, she was in Sudan, and she had to fax in her ballot, and she had to give her ballot to her husband, who then brought it to work, who gave it to a coworker, who gave it to her assistant to fax back. The security of that and the anonymity of that, we don't even need to talk about that. The Votes app for me it's not perfect, but I don't let perfect be the enemy of good. It is better than what we currently have. And as a client of the Votes app, under an NDA, I was able to see third-party audits. So even though those aren't necessarily available to the public because of privacy and because of intellectual property, I refused to work with any vendor that I couldn't get a third-party audit for. So we utilize the National Cybersecurity Center. After every one of our audits, the National Cybersecurity Center coordinates a public audit for us. And citizen auditors can sign up through the National Cybersecurity Center. They can audit our votes, and then I look at that. And we always, and any contract that I sign is going to be open to new discoveries, new technologies. So you're absolutely right. As we go through this process, I find that something like that, for me particularly the Votes app, is a really good balance of third-party audits, better than what we currently have, and moving forward, looking at small pilots that we can improve constantly.
And again, the American Council of the Blind is technology agnostic. We don't care what solution is in place, as long as it allows voters to privately and independently mark, cast, and verify their ballot. And a system like Votes will allow voters who have traditionally faced many barriers to casting their own ballots in West Virginia, a state that has limited transportation options for people with disabilities, has one of the, if not the highest rate of citizens with disabilities in the United States. This may be a very useful option for those people. And given the example for the folks at the State Department, it's very similar for someone with a disability. You know, if you are relying on a third party to mark your intended vote and to verify your ballot and to deliver your ballot, that seems like a pretty insecure supply chain.
Okay, I think that brings us just about to the end.
I do have one other comment that I haven't heard anyone talk about. We've talked a lot about different types of disabilities, but one we haven't talked about are people with like social anxiety. And I do want to keep in mind that the more options we have, some people, if they have like an anxiety disorder, that is a disability, and being able to have options is very helpful for them.
Excellent. One wrap-up question I want to ask, sort of circling back to this morning. There was talk about the LA County solution being one way to offer accessibility by essentially making an accessible process available to every voter, whether or not they have a disability. I'm wondering, and maybe I'm stacking the deck because this is a vote-by-mail panel, if you all think that maybe more of a focus on a vote-by-mail, Colorado model, Voters' Choice Act kind of approach is the way to reduce the options of how everybody casts ballots so that we can make the experience for every voter more accessible. You have 30 seconds. No.
Yes. No, I think it does. I think what we're really talking about in places like Colorado, Utah, California, some of these Western states that are rolling this out is a menu of choices, but it's a menu that just about anybody can participate in the way that they want to, right? So you're not forced into one method or the other. If you want to vote at home at your kitchen table at 3 a.m. in the morning on the Saturday before Election Day, good for you. You can. If you want to come in on Election Day and vote on BMD, good for you. You can. If you want to vote a paper ballot at a polling place, you can. So, I think that allowing for those choices is, for me, important because it drives up turnout. It helps people vote the way that they want to vote. And it does ensure some, I think, a level of security that a one-size-fits-all method might not.
I think that by having more accessibility options available to everyone, they might surprise themselves in how much they actually use it. I wouldn't say that I went out, for example, and bought my iPhone because I have a specific accessibility need, but I do use voice control. I do use VoiceOver to read my email in the morning. I have used the magnifying feature to read small print on something that might be awkwardly placed. And so I think that more people would use these features. If the features were available, they may not self-identify as having that specific need, but if you were able to make the text on the screen just a little bit bigger, and it makes your voting experience better, then why not? Especially if you're talking about the combination of accessibility needs and maybe even language needs. I don't see how you can accommodate that just using paper, and I believe that as more people are coming out to vote, we're going to see more people that are on this spectrum of having particular needs that can be addressed by having more accessible devices.
Well, as has been said earlier, there's no perfect system, or at least we haven't found it yet. And these systems, of course, have their own issues, whether it's voter verification, security, transparency, concerns with voter intimidation. We have to keep all those things in mind as we look at all these different systems. But the one thing I will say that this panel sort of highlights is the evolution of election administration in the United States. It's a whole different place than it was 20 years ago when HAVA was passed. And I think we're going to continue to see some evolution as we go forward. There's a lot of new technology out there. There's some new responsiveness to the voters, I think a lot more than we had seen in the past, and being concerned with the voter experience and how the voters interact with the government when it comes time to cast a ballot. So we're actually living in some pretty historic and interesting times when it comes to elections in the United States. So I want to thank all my panelists for being here. Thank you each for your comments. I think this is a good start to a continuing discussion. And again, thank you all for being here and for your questions as well. Thanks.